Hello and welcome to the Melapress live Q&A. Before we jump into today's episode, a few housekeeping items. Next week, we'll be releasing a new update of our plugin WP2FA. We are introducing passkeys in the plugins, so make sure you update your copy of the plugin if you have it installed. And if you do not have it, make sure you download it and start using 2FA or passkeys. So you have a much more secure authentication. And with passkeys, now your users don't have to remember complex passwords. They can log in without passwords. The other housekeeping item, this is the last episode of the Melapress Q&A for this year. We are stopping a week before for the end of year holidays. But yeah, we'll be back on the second week of January with much more interesting episodes. Follow me on LinkedIn to get notified about upcoming episodes. And that's it for today. Now let's start with today's episode. I've met today's guest at a WordCamp, specifically WordCamp Europe, which for a change goes to show you how great WordCamps are for networking. I mean, most of the guests I have had so far here, I've met through different WordCamps or WordPress meetups. Today's guest focuses, I think the timing for this talk is just right, because given the tightening regulations in the EU, the European Accessibility Act, we have the Cyber Resilience Act coming up, and several other compliance and other regulations coming up in the EU. And it would be nice to see what impact these type of regulations have in the WordPress ecosystem. So I'd like to introduce Lillie Mazitova. Hello, Lillie. How are you? Okay.
Hi, Robert. Great. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. First of all, thank you for your time. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
For those who don't know you, can you start by giving us a brief introduction about you and what you do?
Yes, with pleasure. So my name is Lillie Mazitova, and I'm the founder and project manager at the heart of the company called Rocket Conseil. It's a smaller, relatively small web studio specialized in e-commerce automation, and compliance in the context of e-commerce. And basically, we're at the intersection between web development and consulting in IT, and help our clients anticipate various compliance needs that they might have depending on the projects they're working on or looking to expand to, depending on the market. And we basically handle the technical setup, but with a focus on compliance. And
Nice.
I guess what's interesting to mention as well, like what we have, mainly we work with enterprise level clients, and one of our biggest clients is Hermès, the luxury brand in France.
Nice. Thank you for the introduction. I mean, definitely you're in the right place, because as we were just talking before we started this podcast, Europe is definitely much more heavy when it comes to compliance than the US. So you're definitely you are keeping yourself busy with compliance.
100%.
Exactly. Starting with the basics, because I remember myself when I started working in IT back in 2000. I became a systems engineer, and this was all new to me. So I started hearing about, we're going to have an audit, compliance, auditors, and all these words. And all of a sudden, a technical person, I don't have any legal understanding at all of these things, or I didn't used to have. It becomes a bit overwhelming for technical people. So let's start with the basic. Can you give us your definition of compliance, and how does it fit in the context of websites and e-commerce, for example?
So the broader definition of compliance is essentially that the organization's processes and operations comply with the international and local regulations and law. And it kind of expands into whatever industry this implies. In our case, it's e-commerce. So essentially, it means that the e-commerce platform, or any website for that matter, right? We speak about e-commerce because we mainly focused on e-commerce. But again, any website like web compliance, it complies with different regulations. And again, when we speak about compliance, this word is going to come up a lot. So when we speak about compliance, there's various different topics that go into that. So it's not necessarily one thing, and it differs from market to market, right? From project to project. There can be industry specific compliance to, even in the context of e-commerce. For example, if brands like distribute like hazardous products and things like that. So there's going to be specific local regulation to that. But yeah, broadly, it means that like the website is compliant with all the regulation, respects all the laws, applicable laws. And there are some things that are more well-known, I'd say, and some are less well-known, but that's kind of that.
So compliance is there more to control kind of like what the vendor or vendors can do and to protect the customer, or
yeah, so
exactly mean?
So I like to give this example because I think it's very telling, and because compliance itself was not that big, I think, before like the pandemic, right? So because e-commerce, was there, but it was kind of more like the Wild West. I think it's a good analogy. There was some regulation, but a lot of it was like subject to interpretation by different companies, by different, brands, etc. But when the pandemic happened, essentially, governments started realize, like in Europe specifically, right, because we mainly focus in the European market, but not only, they started to realize that there's a lot of aspects of the like selling online that are not necessarily regulated. And on one side, like the positive impact is that, yes, it's there to kind of protect the privacy, the personal data of customers that purchase online. But at the same time, it's also there in a way to kind of control like retail, right? There are certain regulations related to retail, so kind of goes in the same sense, and it's just another avenue that the government uses to essentially set up a specific set of rules that have to be respected.
Interesting. You mentioned the Corona pandemic, and it's like during that pandemic, like the world shifted online, kind of thing.
There were a lot.
Yeah.
There were a lot of changes. For example, one of the biggest one that came out of it was the change the law related to VAT regulations. So that was on the 1st of July 2021, like right after it, like in the midst of it, you could say. And it changed how like the VAT was processed for online purchases. So in that sense, it was not necessarily like that it was useful for specific customers that were doing their purchases online, but it was a way for the government to start collecting, additional, kind of what's happening in the US with like the tariffs right now, right? There were certain products like less than 22 euros, for example, that were exempt of VAT regulation. So that was, the customers didn't have to pay that. So that changed. Then there was the introduction of one-stop shop, import one-stop shop as well. It changed the way they collect VAT. Like before that, VAT was collected based on the business's entity location. So, for example, if the business was located in France, the VAT that would be collected on the products would always be 20%, right? If it was based in Germany, the VAT that would be collected would be 21%. What changed with that legislation specifically is that the VAT that is collected is now based on the shipping address of the customer. If the threshold or like all over EU is past more than 10,000 euros, which is the case for a majority of e-commerce websites operating in the EU today. So now the VAT would have to be collected based on the customer's address. So that implies the way you structure data behind the way you process the checkout. There were a lot of changes in regards to that, but it was a way for governments, officially, obviously they would say, to simplify the collection of VAT, but in practice that would mean a lot of purchases that were not previously, taxed, and there was no VAT on it because they were, coming from China. A lot of the times, there was like this whole boom about, basically doing drop shipping, and a lot of brands were doing that, even, the ones that managed to kind of build a lot of storytelling around their company. That was still the case. So yeah, in that sense, it was a way to, to collect more revenue. And that's why I say like it was a Wild West before. And then the governments were like, hey, like why are we not part of this? Why is like all of this extra revenue is like going aside from us? So in that sense, I don't think it was necessarily to benefit the customer, right? It was more just to a new set of rules.
Yeah. In fact, based on my experience, they didn't simplify the VAT process. They made it much more complex.
Not at all. And for businesses now, like it's the way you process data and the checkout, the structure, the setup of the checkout is so much more complex now. There's so much to take into account, like where your customers are based, where your storage locations are, where the product comes from, where the business is registered. So there's no longer like one thing. There's just like a list of things that need to be taken into account. So yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I realized there are also some exceptions as well. Like if you are selling something that wasn't produced in that country, there are a lot of these exceptions which applies.
So there was two different things. So there was the import one-stop shop and one-stop shop. Like it's essentially it's a law, but it's also a portal through which like the companies can now register and have one VAT number instead of like they say have multiple numbers. But the main change is that now no matter where the product comes from, the customer always pays the VAT based on the shipping country. So let's say my business is registered in France and you are based in Netherlands, the VAT that you would be paying for a product, even if it's shipped from China, despite the fact that my business is registered in France, you would be paying VAT rate of Netherlands. You wouldn't be paying VAT rate. In this case, if it was coming from China, you would be exempt, right? Before this law, now you wouldn't be exempt. You would be paying VAT. So, and usually, obviously businesses have to offset the cost. So it came on to the customer. So it doesn't mean that the goods became any cheaper than before.
So basically compliance, just to make this clear, it's not just about websites. It can also be about government regulations, taxes, and so it's not just about your website and certain compliance. It's not just about PCI DSS. We're also talking about taxes and maybe some procedures, shipping, and there's almost compliance in every industry, right? Yeah.
It's an all-encompassing term, but there's a variety of things that go into it, right? So we've just spoken about, VAT compliance related to how you process invoices, right? So this impacts obviously the e-commerce website, but then there's also the GDPR, which we kind of mentioned in our off-the-record conversation before. Then there is obviously the Cybersecurity Act and the Digital Accessibility Act. And there's the Green IT in the context of social corporate responsibility, right? So then there's the PCI DSS certification and payment security. So there's just a variety of things, and it doesn't necessarily mean that all the websites overall, or even all e-commerce websites, have to, comply with all the set of these legislations. It depends how they process data and what they do with this data, and what's applicable in their specific case. But yes, compliance overall is just a set of rules that has to be respected by the website, essentially. And that's what we do essentially, right? We anticipate, what's going to be applicable for each specific case.
Nice. So the country in which your business operates and where your clients are actually can have an impact on the type of compliance that applies for your website?
Yes, 100%. So it's not the same. In some cases, it can be related to a specific industry. I definitely say that Europe is more heavily regulated than the US, for example. But what's important to realize that when we speak about e-commerce, a lot of the times we're speaking about cross-border e-commerce, right? Even if the business, let's say, is registered in France, it doesn't mean that they're selling only to European customers, right? They could be selling to the US customers, right? So it's a US storefront, perhaps also a different language. So this implies the fact that if the e-commerce website operates on the US market and is selling to US customers, it also has to comply with the US regulation. It doesn't necessarily mean they only have to comply with the European regulation. It depends essentially on the market that the business is distributing on. So it can be very complex, and one of the most difficult aspects of e-commerce is essentially cross-border e-commerce, not only because of languages. That's one set of tasks, like in relation to WordPress especially, but overall, just to the fact that it's a cross-border business.
Yeah. And I think it's very important that most compliance is, for example, because many people kind of misunderstand this, I think. If you are a US-based company and you are selling in Europe, or based in China and you are selling in Europe, then of course your business has to comply with the European compliance. And it works the other way around, right? If we are a European-based company and want to sell in the US, you have to comply with the US
100%. And what's especially complex is that the regulation that you have to comply with can sometimes be very different, right? There can be one set of rules that applies for the US storefront, and another set of rules that has to apply for the European storefront, and another set of rules that applies to another continent. So, and that's the complexity of essentially managing a cross-border e-commerce website. So, and I think this is a common misunderstanding. A lot of, companies think that, okay, if we're based in one specific country and we respect the legislation of this country, this is where our business is registered. We are not necessarily concerned with, with the US legislation. What does it have to do with us? But that's the common pitfall. And in my experience, we have actually had a couple of clients that reached out to us after they got fined already, right? Depending on the market they were, operating in. A lot of the times it comes down to that. And, their understanding, it was very vague because, for example, one thing that they did in regards to their European storefront would be considered compliant, and in the US it's not considered compliant. So, and they didn't check into it. They thought, okay, that's kind of more or less the same, we're respecting broader regulation. But yeah, there are some specifics to take into account 100%.
Interesting. About compliance and the different markets, obviously it applies mostly for e-commerce. However, are there any other type of websites that should be concerned about compliance? For example, if I have a hobby blog, or if I have a newsletter subscription, like, are there like any apart from e-commerce, which other types of websites owners should be worried about compliance?
Well, I think all websites are concerned with compliance, and one way or the other. It's just the legislation they have to be concerned with differs. That's one thing. And the second thing is, obviously, a smaller merchant that sells beads bracelets and sells them on an Etsy store or something like that, or promotes them on their own blog. They're going to be less concerned by it because they're the bigger institutions, they're not going to be looking for a smaller merchant, right, to find, because the whole idea behind like compliance is that if you don't respect certain set of rules, you could get fined. But a smaller merchant is not necessarily going to be targeted by bigger institutions for a fine, that they're not necessarily, like, for the legislations they're not necessarily respecting. That being said, some things are universal, and depending on how much data you process, how much customer data you process, the compliance can get more heavy. That's why we speak a lot about e-commerce, because e-commerce, you obviously have the banking data, the transactions, like customer personal data, information, etc. And that's not the case for a simpler blog or a online recipe website, something like that. So they're less concerned in that regards. But one of the good, I think, examples of compliance that concerns everyone, it's the security certificate, the HTTPS protocol, which is, you wouldn't think about it as compliance, but it is, right? So it concerns all websites, whether they're an e-commerce website or a smaller blog. This is a kind of a protocol that is required by majority of browsers for navigation by customers, by visitors. So in that case, all the websites are concerned. Another, I think, legislation is the GDPR. Again, it differs how you process the data, but if you have any visitors visiting your website, they have to accept cookies. You have to show this famous banner, like, are you accepting the cookies, select the cookies, etc. So again, this legislation concerns all websites, not necessarily only e-commerce websites. So yeah.
Interesting. So yeah, focusing on e-commerce, and you mentioned things even like Etsy.
Mm-hmm.
So if instead of having your own e-commerce store, it's zero, but if instead of building your own e-commerce store, you use an online SaaS service like Shopify,
Mm-hmm.
then is the responsibility of the compliance of your store still yours, or is it of Shopify?
That's a very interesting question, and I think there's also a lot of misunderstanding in regards to that. So when brands use a SaaS platform like Shopify, it doesn't mean that Shopify is responsible for respecting all the compliance legislation. So if there is let's say a check, a verification by a government institution of a specific website or brand, and the website itself is not compliant, it's not Shopify that's going to get fined, it's the brand that's going to get fined, right? And there's certain legislation Shopify specifically doesn't respect, because Shopify now, from very recently, they're headquartered in the US also. So they have a very different framework in regards to certain aspects and certain things that are not necessarily compliant with the European legislation. So that means the brand itself is exposing itself to risk that is not necessarily, I'd say, considered when taking the decision to work with Shopify or any other SaaS platforms. That being said, of course, there are certain things that there's an overlap of things that the SaaS platform could comply with, but it doesn't mean it complies with everything, right? For example, a great example in that regards could be like digital accessibility, right? So digital accessibility, just to Clarified means that the website is accessible to users and visitors of different handicap situations, right? If somebody's blind, or if somebody has hearing issues or dyslexia or limited mobility, all of these different types of issues, the website has to be accessible for all of these types of users. So in regards to digital accessibility, a lot of it is impacted by selecting a specific theme that your website is going to be run on, or building your own theme. So Shopify has nothing to do with that, right? So the responsibility is essentially going to be on the theme that you select, right? Is the theme compliant with the digital accessibility? And if it is, in which way? This is for the brand to check, for the specific business to check, and for the merchant to take accountability for, not necessarily for the theme developer, even if they announce that formally.
I see. So in a way, having your own store, which there are many benefits in my opinion, because of course of WordPress, but also from the compliance point of view, you definitely have more freedom and flexibility to build whatever you want, to make sure what you are building matches matches the requirements that meets the requirements that are required, right?
Yes, 100%. So first, we are big advocates in general. I don't want to sound biased, but we're in the WordPress community. But
exactly,
yeah. But we are definitely big advocates of building on open source. WordPress and WooCommerce is a great platform for that. It's a great CMS for that, and it essentially what it allows you as a brand and as a business entity to control how you build your website, how you structure the data behind your website, and what legislation you have to comply with. And it also keeps, the code clean. You don't have, things that are not necessarily you're not necessarily concerned with. And it allows to, I think it allows to scale more easily in that regards, considering that, the landscape, there's like such complexification of landscape in regards to compliance. Each time there's something new, which is difficult to anticipate sometimes. And it gives you, open source gives you the flexibility of, building another brick without necessarily having to, smash everything and start from the beginning, which is a lot of the times the case with, SaaS platforms, right? They're going to build something. It's an isolated case, depending on what's happening in the industry or in a specific time period right now. But as times change and the legislation changes, new requirements might appear, and all of a sudden you realize, like, okay, well, now in order for us to comply, we have to change, for example, the whole theme. And as you can imagine, changing the whole theme, it's almost equivalent to rebuilding your website. So in that case, open source allows for more flexibility, completely custom code, and it allows more leeway to adapt to different legislation depending on the market, for sure.
Interesting. Sometimes it's definitely possible. Like if you want to build your own e-commerce store, it's definitely possible to use something like WordPress. However, what about? We still, as your business grows, you're going to rely on other services. You have like newsletter services, tracking software like Google Analytics, maybe a CRM software. As a website owner, what can I do, or like what checks and balances are there in place to make sure that the services that I'm using are compliant with the market I'm selling in?
Well, usually if it's a big player, right, of any type of SaaS, for example, an emailing platform, usually they of course usually they always like announce it on their platform if they're compliant with certain regulation. But other than that, I'd say the responsibility 100% is on the business entity, right? It's for the business entity to evaluate first what legislation and which regulation they need to comply with. As again, we mentioned in the beginning, there's many different things. Not all of them are applicable to every single platform. So it's to evaluate which kind of legislation you need to comply with, and then see, okay, like the solution is this technical stack that I'm selecting for the specific project. Is it relevant, or does it respect the legislation that I'm concerned with or not? And that's always a case by case basis, right? Unfortunately, I would love to give you a very simplified answer that, if the responsibility is always like on the vendor of any specific solution, but that's not the case. Each specific company is responsible for their own technical stack, and sometimes it can create conflicts. A lot of the times, especially with the US based SaaS products, that's there's always this conversation also around the data framework transfer between the EU and the US. So that's also a subject in itself. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no perfect solution, no perfect answer. Everything is a case-by-case basis and needs to be checked.
Yeah, one thing that concerns me is that compliance is clearly, it depends what you're doing, of course, but it can be quite complex. So at what point, I know there's no exactly like hard line, but at what point does it become too risky or too complex for a business owner on their own versus bringing a legal specialist? Because if I have an e-commerce store, even if it's a hobby, if I'm selling more than $10,000 per year, I need definitely, and I'm selling online, I need to be compliant. But compliance most probably is the last thing on my mind, or the last something that I'm not going to understand. Like, is there any hope or help for these type of users who maybe don't have the resources to bring in a specialist, but they do need to be compliant? Because it seems like there's so much that we need nowadays. The more complex the internet is becoming, the more complex the compliance is becoming. So running a website is no longer, hey, let's just set up a website. It's becoming like a really complex task, So what resources does these small business owners have? And at what point do they have to really seek legal advice?
I think, I don't want to, sound like alarmist or anything like that. Obviously, it's a very complex topic, but I'd say like the rule of thumb is, if your brand has a noticeable following and you're starting to generate a significant revenue, according to what you feel is a significant revenue, because again, it can differ from business to business. And if your brand and company has like certain visibility and you're attracting a lot of attention, because if you're attracting the attention of your customers, you could potentially attract the attention of, verifying institutions and organizations. So, and again, even customers, right? There are customers that at some point, that's the customers themselves who are signaling your e-commerce website or any website as non-compliant institutions, right? So that has to be kept in mind. Yeah. So at some point, when your website gets to that point and you feel, there is a certain responsibility that starts to build up in that regards, or maybe as a brand, you're starting to get these messages from the customers mentioning certain things, or, starting to inquire about how are their, personal data is processed, or asking what's the retention policy of the data, or, inquiring about like how the cookies management works, or if the brand has a consentment management platform. If you're starting to get these kinds of questions, I think it's safe to say this is the time to perhaps first seek maybe more information in that regards, and to check resources available to you and start paying attention to this aspect, because a lot of it can be done using, in the case of WordPress, right? There are many fantastic plugins and many fantastic solutions that can be set up relatively easily. You don't need a legal specialist. You don't need a technical specialist to do that. For example, consentment management platform, right? This can be done relatively quickly. So, but perhaps you didn't think about that. In that sense, I think the rule of thumb is if you're getting any traction and, negative tension in that regards, and if you feel like the brand is attracting more attention, it's time to consider more significant, paying more attention to compliance. And if you're starting to get too complex for you to handle as a business owner, if it's smaller business, maybe it's time to bring in a specialist. So yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned when customers start asking you, for example, about retention policies. It's just a curiosity question. So if I'm doing everything correctly and I have everything in my privacy policy and terms of services, everything on the website, as a vendor, am I legally obliged to answer to that customer, or does the customer is legally obliged to check the terms and services themselves rather than me having to answer all these type of questions?
I mean, it goes both ways. First of all, yes, of course, you're supposed to have the boring legal documents on your website, the privacy policy, general conditions of sales, all of those things. A lot of the times, the customer can ask specific question in regards to that. And as a brand, you're first of all, you're going to want to provide a good service and answer to these questions. But at some point, if you like the customer starts implying that something goes against I'd say like industry-wide regulation to what's mentioned in your privacy policy or general conditions of sales, you are, as a brand, are 100% responsible for what's marked in these documents. And again, a lot of the times people, like business entities, they see these documents as something, it's a boring piece of paper. You can just like find a template online. I'll just add whatever and don't necessarily pay attention to it when you're getting started. But it is a legal document, right? So whatever you write in there, all the processes that are set up on your website, they have to comply with that. So if you're saying, let's say, send us a request if you want your, personal data deleted, you have to have a process in place on your website to delete customer data within a specified time frame that's indicated in your legal document. So those kinds of things kind of go hand in hand in that regards.
That you work in this industry, are you seeing like a trend where the end user, the customer, is becoming more aware of and they're asking more about these questions? Because like 10 years ago, someone asking you for the retention policy, like that's unheard of. But nowadays, you can see, is it like a trend that do you think that
100%,
the end user is becoming a bit more aware about this?
Yeah, 100% more aware. But I'd be very cautious to say for which reasons they're getting aware of that. In the US, like unfortunately, we've as an agency, we've had like clients that essentially deal with customers that are not necessarily messaging them or sending their lawyers, hiring lawyers for certain things that are not compliant, not because they genuinely had, let's say, a bad customer experience, but because it's a way for them to make money. It's a business, especially in the US, right? One thing they find, one thing that you're not compliant with, hey, like it's payday, So there's a lot of that. Unfortunately, that's what I'm saying. Like brands and business entities have to be wary of the fact that customers are contributing to that in one way or the other. But overall, I'd say yes, there is definitely more cautiousness from customers, and they're asking more these questions. But again, I think it comes from a place because like there's such complexification of the industry. Even customers sometimes they don't necessarily understand. We're bombarded with these like cookie banners nonstop. Like a lot of them are starting to stop and ask like, hey, like what is happening? Like, because when nobody's asking you the question, you're not necessarily thinking about this. But when you were starting to see these banners all the time, you're like, okay, so what's happening to my data, right? So there's definitely more attention in that regards. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative, but 100% there's a trend for that.
Yeah, in fact, you mentioned the cookie banner. That I think, in my opinion, it's one of the classic examples where compliance kind of doesn't exactly align with the real world behavior. Because I look at myself, I don't know how many websites I visit. Nowadays, users are just used to just click. So it's not serving the purpose of protecting the user and knowing where their data is. Like when there is a problem where compliance has become more of a nuisance more than actually having a purpose, how can we go about those type of issues and solve them?
Well, Robert, you mentioned just a fantastic thing, because I think everyone is like sick and tired of these cookie banners.
Yes.
Did you see this meme of a guy like stuffing literal physical cookies in the other guy's mouth, and he's like, "You're visiting a website now, like take some cookies," and he's like, "I don't want any cookies. Like, have some more cookies." So it's definitely become that. And yeah, it's skewed the other way. I think the intention, and we've been speaking about that for years at this point, right? The intention behind GDPR was to protect customer data. In a lot of countries, there were a lot of scammers, right, online. It was to avoid that, to make the website visiting experience for users more safe, more secure. And it's also, I think it's a kind of a stamp of validation if the website is processing their data correctly and, shows the cookie banner that it's a respectful, website, it's a serious platform, it's not going to be a scamming platform, which was the case before, right? So the initial intention was good, but now it gotten to a point because the user experience behind it is so negative, and because again you're visiting thousands of websites where you're bombarded with these banners, and you have to like click accept or deny. There's actually more people who deny these banners, but that happens. It definitely is a negative experience. I fully agree with you that the legislation doesn't necessarily do much benefit to like customers' experience. There is, I think, certain realization on behalf of European institutions in that regards. They're starting to speak. Like there was a public discussion in November 2025, like very recently, a month ago. They came out with the initiative and proposition called Digital Omnibus. It's essentially a new legislation that aims, to simplify the way cookies are collected and make it more related to browsers than necessarily to a specific website, to essentially simplify the customer experience, to keep the general idea of customer data protection, but make the experience for the customer easier for the website visitor, not the customer, like a website visitor. So let's see where this goes. It's still very rudimentary. So there were public consultations throughout the summer. A lot of actually very great companies. Like I'm a big fan of Didomi's newsletter. I don't know if you've heard of Didomi. Didomi is it's a French-based consentment management platform, and they actually have a fantastic newsletter in regards to GDPR legislation, and they're very on top of what they're doing. And they were actually part of this digital omnibus proposition. So just a quick shout out to them. So it's great. It's great to see that I think legal institutions are consulting, players in the field and in the industry, because again, it's a consent management platform. They're collecting this information about, how users actually navigate websites and, what's the experience been like for them, in order to perhaps eventually make a better proposal and a better legislation in place for all the users. But I think it's kind of like with any legislation, right? It has to go like very badly first for then to be a happy medium to be found. So yeah, and overall society trends, there's a lot of like radicalism can be involved. So it needs to skew this way before it gets back to the middle and starts being actually useful again.
Yes, it's also, I think, a problem. Authorities in general move very slow, and the internet moves very fast. So, of course,
True.
this cookie banner, and I've seen this even in real life. For example, this happens in security, even in websites. For example, I remember when I used to work at software companies in the early days, we used to have like compliance. Okay, like the customer data needs to be encrypted, but it doesn't specify anywhere. Just because it's encrypted doesn't mean it's secure, because in the compliance, it doesn't specify anywhere that the encryption keys should be stored separately, not in the same database. So of course, and I've seen also in real life, a few meters further down from our house, there's this transformer unit, electricity transformer unit, high voltage, etc. And in front of it, there's a gate, but just in front of it. So you can actually walk around the gate. And I'm presuming it's one of those cases where the compliance said, this is a dangerous thing, so it should be protected by a gate. But no one said it should be also surrounded by a fence.
Yeah.
So it's yeah. So do you think sometimes, like, with all these new compliance regulations, especially in Europe, as we said, like Europe compared to the US tends to be a bit more compliance focused, more compliance heavy, such as Cyber Resilience Security Act, the European Accessibility Act, now there is the EU AI Act as well. Do you think that kind of like sometimes hinders both user experience and also product and innovation?
100%. I mean, it's good business for us because there's a lot of work, and there you never have one project that's exactly the same, so it keeps things moving and dynamic. But I think on the business entity side, it 100% hinders innovation. It again makes just launching any project that more complex, because there's just so much things to analyze and to take into consideration. And just the idea, before, I think in US it's just easier, if no matter which project you're doing, and if you just want to do like a proof of concept on, for startups, especially if you want to launch something very quickly, you can come out with a product very quickly. I don't think that's the case for the European market. Again, like maybe you could say, yeah, take the risk, we're a small entity, we're not going to attract that much attention. For sure, fair game, that can have its place, but in general, it 100% hinders innovation, and makes just even for brands that do exist, it makes operations that much heavier, because again, all of the legislation keeps changing, right? So
Yes.
It's just a never-ending process of staying relevant and respecting any specific legislation that the brand is concerned with. So I'm not a specialist in AI in any shape or form, but for example, like the digital omnibus initiative that I mentioned earlier in regards to GDPR, it also simplify the initial proposals in the EU AI Act, because they're starting to feel this competition from especially now with the new US administration. They're trying kind of to lift the curtain and take a lot, like simplify even already some, compared to European markets, simplified legislation, make things even easier. So I'm going to be launching these types of projects. They're not going to be looking at a EU, right? They're not going to be headquartering their companies and basing their businesses in Europe, because why to the US and start things off relatively quickly and not be threatened by any fines. And unfortunately, like it's true. I mean, like, I'm very sad to say it, but I think a lot of the times in the EU, European market in general, the legislation is just it's a way to for the governments to generate additional revenue because of the fines, right? So brands that do not comply, you get a fine. It's it fills up the treasury, right? So a lot of it is unfortunately that. And in regards to, I think I think SpaceX was the one that was fined most recently in the EU.
X,
Twitter. Like the recent one, 140 million. Yeah, that was basically like a couple of days ago, right? So again,
Yes.
So that kind of goes hand in hand.
Yes, if you speak to any website owner nowadays, even small, when I go to different meetups, everyone is aware about these issues. Like, we're talking about Europe now, because we're both based in Europe. Is there a place for website owners, business owners, or like a means where people can get in touch with the authorities and kind of like give feedback and help with maybe designing new laws or new regulations?
Yes, definitely. Like, for example, it's actually a French legal institution, but kind of oversees the whole GDPR process. It's called CNIL.
Okay.
So you can definitely send them as a user, as an initiative group or as a business entity. You can probably get in touch with them and, make some suggestions, which is, I think, what happened in regards to the digital omnibus initiative that they're speaking a lot right now. They had a public consultation, so that is taken into account, like the public feedback. In which capacity, I'm not in measure to answer, and I cannot say like how long the process takes. But I think if you're a player in this industry, I do think at some level you have an impact. Another example of that would be the initiative in regards to green IT in the context of corporate social responsibility. For now, it's compliance, but it's not compliance that's fine. It's not related to getting fined. It's not regulatory based in that sense. For now, it remains an initiative, and a lot of different institutions and even different web agencies that are specialized in green IT and eco-responsible web development, they are making contributions to the web referential in regards to that, the set of rules that kind of companies have to comply with in regards to eco-responsible web development. So there is definitely an outlet for making your contribution visible. Again, don't know how much impact that would have, but the mechanism is definitely in place. And I think it depends. It depends it depends how advanced I think the legislation is. If it's like, I think, rudimentary or kind of in the public consultation stage, an impact can be made. But if it's something more, related to VAT, for example,
It's good to know that there are. Yeah, but it's good to know that there are some sort of channels and options that that's where you can submit some feedback, because it's especially compliance. It's a bit of I have mixed feelings about compliance, because I understand why it's done, of course, to stop abuse, but sometimes it also gets a lot in the way of product builders and also the customers. So it's good to find and I understand it's not easy to find the right balance of making the customer happy, also the product builder, and
I think the market is very fragmented, right? So we're not only speaking about different legislation that is regulated by different institutions, we're also speaking about different countries, right? We keep saying EU, but each country, in Europe might have a different take on even an EU-wide regulation, right? How it's fined, what the mechanism behind the process is. So it's not universal. There's no universal rule, unfortunately. So there is, some give and take in that regards.
Yeah, just look at the VAT. There's a standard framework, but then every country has different rates, different types of way of doing things, different ways how to submit report. It's all different. So yeah, going back to the websites. You've worked on a lot of websites, both as project manager, but also from the compliance point of view. What are the most common compliance oversights you see when auditing websites?
I think I'll stay fresh, and I'll just mention the European Accessibility Act. I'm going to probably sound very kind of on our plate the last 6 to 8 months, and there has been more buzz about this subject. So starting from the 28th of June this year, essentially what happened is the European Accessibility Act that was already in place. It introduced fines for non-compliance, which was not the case, right? So before it was more kind of recommendation based, right? The brands had to comply with it, but there was no mechanism for being fined. Now, so their brand, like companies and business entities, can get fined for the amount from 25,000 to 50,000 euros, renewable every 6 months, and it makes things way more concrete. So a lot of the e-commerce platforms, and even not necessarily e-commerce platforms, any websites for that matter, that didn't necessarily think that it would, concern them. Now they had to start working in that regards and making their website compliant and digitally accessible. And again, now the perimeter itself just is way more large. Before it was only for bigger companies, for large corporate entities. Now all platforms with and all companies with more than 10 employees and turnover of more than 2 million, either or, right? So if you're a business entity operating in the EU and you have more than 10 employees, and your product, in this case, product is an e-commerce website or any website for that matter, is not compliant, you could get the risk of getting a fine. So this has definitely been one of the hot topics lately. Not to say it's the only one, but I think the most recent one this year. And I think next year, my prediction is there's going to be a lot more talk about the Cyber Resilience Act that's coming into place, right? So from June 2026, if I'm not mistaken,
I think yes, they start the first.
They have to start. It's in place. Legislation is in place now, but companies are going to have to start filling out the self-assessment surveys from June. So that's going to be a bigger topic. So again, I think it just proves things keeps changing, and there's going to be different things appearing and different legislation that have to be taken into account. But this year it was the digital accessibility.
For those who are not familiar, can you give us just a short, brief summary of what is the Digital Accessibility Act?
Yeah, so the Digital Accessibility Act is essentially the European legislation that ensures that a website or an e-commerce platform is accessible to users and visitors and customers in different handicap situations. And when we speak about handicap situation, this can vary from, blind users or users that have difficulty hearing or users that have dyslexia, Parkinson users that have reduced mobility, permanent or temporary. So a wide variety of essentially different physical issues that could limit the navigation on the website and completing the action that the website serves the purpose of. So in the commerce of in the case of e-commerce website, it's to complete a purchase. So the European Accessibility Act is based on the web content regulation that sets specific. There's a set of specific rules and criteria that have to be respected for the users to be able to navigate the website safely. So there is a wide variety of technical requirements. But if I had to, stream it down, the main thing is that the website has to be able to be screened by screen readers for navigation, and that the website is respecting color contrast, that the data is structured correctly, and so that the main purpose of the website is to complete the transaction that could be realized on the platform. So this is what the European Accessibility Act is about. And then the US, they're actually a similar legislation, not exactly the same, but it's the Disabled for Americans Act. So that's also in place as well. Yeah.
Interesting. There are different types of websites and different types of regulations. However, there's a lot of overlap between the overlaps, like between the regulations. Most frameworks usually focus on privacy, security, transparency, customer rights, and similar stuff. In your opinion, like for anyone who's new and wants to kind of like evaluate their website and get started, like which are the 3 highest impact actions a website business owner can take to move towards like being a bit more compliant, regardless of any compliance framework, just to make sure privacy focused and a bit more transparency? Which are the top 3?
The top 3. Well, I think digital accessibility, 100%, the European Accessibility Act, or the ADA Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act for the US market, not only because it focuses on compliance, but because it has factual benefits for users and user experience, right? So you're essentially allowing more customers to complete purchase on your website. So that's beneficial for business. And overall, it just makes the code of the website cleaner, refactored, and so there's a bigger purpose, I'd say. It also impacts the search engine optimization because, your data is correctly structured and correctly mapped. So that, I'd say, would be number 1 for me. Number 2, I'd say, GDPR, and to be more specific, setup of consent management platforms, right? So that you have a registry, that you're collecting data correctly, that you have processes in place for data retention and how to delete, the procedure to delete user data, the procedure to export user data, that you have all of that in place. And I think the last one is, if we speak about e-commerce, it would definitely be the VAT legislation related to how you collect VAT, the import one-stop shop and one-stop shop procedures. So that would be the top 3.
Are there any tools that website owners can use, like with which you can scan your website or audit your website or go to a checklist that website owners can use to check?
Unfortunately not. There is not one place you can go and, get all the information and kind of go through it and tick the boxes. Okay, we're good with that. We're good with that. There are definitely resources available. I mean, even the resource that we as an agency refer to a lot, we prefer to always refer to official sources. And I think that's kind of, the best advice I can give is to always refer to official sources. In France, and I'm sure there's similar, platforms, in Germany or even Netherlands, there's a platform called Numérique, gouv.fr. So it's essentially an initiative. It's a government set up platform, right? It's an official source, but it collects all the related legislation related to digital environment and in general, platforms, everything related to online. And there's different information constantly appearing, different news published there, and it kind of allows to sift through certain information and already have, I'd say, certain level of understanding what the brand might be concerned with. But I think it's a great starting point for sure. Yeah, I don't think there's a universal, unfortunately, source, but it's definitely a great starting point. For example, in the numérique gouv.fr, you can already find information about digital accessibility, about GDPR that we mentioned, also about like green IT. So that's also already like a handful to read through. And actually, the positive point, it's actually very well structured. The information is very comprehensible and digestible, and they're great examples, right? It's not a legal paper, right? When you get like a law book, and it's just a comprehensible language. So it's actually very clear, well structured, and very interpretable, even for someone not necessarily familiar with like legal jargon or even like technical aspects of building a website. So yeah, I'd recommend that research, and it's available in English as well.
That's good to know, because one of my biggest concerns usually is like when you read, you can find even like not just government, but even something like the PCI DSS, you can find the document, but because of the way it's written, like in its own legal terms and stuff, it's usually for a person like me, who I'm not a legal person, it's open to interpretation. Like, what does this exactly mean? Or does this mean we should do it like this or like this? So by knowing there's a more user-friendly or
and there are actually great examples in there, like for in the case of digital accessibility, they write out the criteria, and then there's an example illustrating the criteria. Right. Nice. Sometimes a very visual example, so it helps understanding, okay, what is this criteria actually referring to? So I would give the shout out where it's due, give props when it's due. So it's a very well done platform, even though, yes, of course, it's it's still certain like technical jargon, but I think it's more interpretable than any, like in France there's a website called Legifrance, and it's where they publish all the decrets and all the legal information published actually by the government, which obviously you can't read through. So that one is actually a good starting source, I'd say.
Is it a problem you encounter? Like sometimes you speak to someone, just because it's your word, you end up using certain legal terms that other people don't understand you.
Oh yeah, 100%. But I think the most important thing in the compliance industry in general, it's more about being aligned on which terminology you use. And I think it's good sometimes maybe to re-ask, okay, what kind of vocabulary are we using? Are we speaking about the same thing? I mean, but I think that goes overall in regards to, web development, right? Because when the client says like, oh, just make it look nice, right? There's nothing worse than, you know what I mean? Like, make it look nice.
Exactly. Definitely.
For me, nice, it means bigger banner. Like for you, nice means, smaller, pop-up banner at the bottom of the screen. So I think overall it's just important to use the same vocabulary and, not be ashamed to ask these questions and have these conversations. And even for us, again, like I said, like, no matter which project we work on, there's always like something new that comes up that's not necessarily the same, and it's not something that we have encountered prior. So yeah, there's always a discussion, especially with industry-specific regulation. Like recently, we were working with a client that deals with hazardous products, and now there is the European Act related to general product safety regulation that expanded to e-commerce as well from last December 2024. So there are certain aspects of this legislation that now impact how you present hazardous products on an e-commerce website. And we are aware what it means in regards to e-commerce, but we're not aware, for example, like of industry-specific standards related to hazardous products. So in that sense, it's a collaboration, even with the customer themselves, with the client on our end, informing us and how they process these products, like how they have to ship them, because obviously it's going to impact how you present the same information online. So in that sense, I think it's very important for it to be an open conversation that goes two ways.
Yes, and people need to learn how to ask. I've noticed a couple of times, I've been in a few meetings where people mention something, and then you walk out of this meeting and someone asks you, what was he saying exactly? What was this word? And people don't, and I think I've seen it in compliance as well. People don't understand, but they nod, and then after they realize, oh, we should have asked, So it's very important to ask.
It's the famous joke about synergies, right? Like let's make sure synergies, like, what does it mean exactly? Like, exactly, nobody knows what it means.
Exactly.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Lillie. Did we miss anything, or is there anything else in particular that you'd like to mention?
I mean, I think we've missed a lot because it's a very wide topic. I think we've covered the essentials. I think we've already covered the essentials, the most important thing. But again, the landscape is very large, very complexified. But if we missed anything, and if anyone has any questions to ask, I'd be happy to follow up after. So that's that.
Yeah, I was going to mention, where can people find you?
They can message me on LinkedIn.
Good. Yeah, in fact, I was going to mention as well that, in fact, I already agreed with Lillie that this was going to be more of a generic compliance episode, and hopefully in the future we'll have more episodes where we talk more specifically maybe about a specific or a number of specific frameworks. Thank you very much, Lillie. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert. Thank you so much for having me. It was a great chat. Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for following, and we'll see you next year. Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks.
Bye.